Today I have with me Dr. Nick Morgan, a communications theorist and coach. Welcome.
Thanks, Tom. Pleasure to be with you in some sense in cyberspace.
Yes, thanks for the virtual meetup. And this conversation is to take some of your expertise and help educate CIOs and IT leaders how it can be best applied for them. I think a lot of what you have to offer really resonates. I know that because you spoke at a conference of about 80 IT executives in the Boston SIM organization in the Boston area recently, and it was one of the highest rated topics and speakers we've done in a long time. And I think what you have to offer really resonates, and folks will find this valuable. I want to back up for a second and just talk about you've done a lot of work and put a few books out into the public domain. So one of them is "Give Your Speech, Change the World: How to Move an Audience to Action." That's one of my favorites. I've read it more than one time, and I have found your advice to be, great in terms of pulling together the theory, but also giving some practical guidance on how to put that into action. Your second book is called "Trust Me: 4 Steps to Authenticity and Charisma," and you have a book coming out next spring, which is "Power Cues: The Subtle Science of Leading Groups, Persuading Others, and Maximizing Your Personal Impact." So all of this stuff is really in that realm of leadership presence, communication, the skills that CIOs and IT leaders highly value and need. And I also, before I forget, at the end, I want to mention your website, publicwords.com, where there's a lot of blogs and articles that come out in this space. So that's just to give a little bit of groundwork on the body of your work. So with that, I'd like to jump in and say that I go to a lot of IT events and conferences, and one of the things I notice is a particular challenge for us in the field is we're very technical people. And so I think sometimes it's hard for us to separate the signal from the noise. So a lot of presentations I'll go to, folks feel compelled to share with you the process by which they came through things, all the details, to look at it from all angles. That's what we do as systems people. What's some of your advice, let's say in the presentation realm, that you have for us that could help sort of distill that into a clear message to be brought across?
Yeah, it's a real occupational hazard for IT folks because you're trained typically as engineers. And engineers are fact-based, prove-it-to-me kind of people. And they learn to base things on science. And that's a good thing. That's why bridges don't fall down, at least most of the time. And that's why our computers work as well as they do. So we cherish that, we value that. But when you're trying to communicate with other people, our ability to handle data is very, very limited, especially in an oral form. So when you're listening to a speech, they say people can remember something like 5 things plus or minus 2. That list or that mental hopper very quickly gets filled. And as a result, very soon you're starting to forget the first thing that the person told you. If you approach it that way, as telling people a series of facts, instead what you've got to do is tell them stories. And I always say stories are facts with emotion tagged on, added in. And as soon as you start getting into that emotional area, tough for IT people to do because they're not trained that way. But as soon as you start telling stories, then suddenly you get much more memorable, and people have this ability to retain much more what you say. So that's the basic argument. Where I start with people is I say, okay, I've got to persuade you to stop being quite so fact-based and be a little bit more of a storyteller.
Now, I saw you speak at this meeting, and that's in fact how you started. You set the groundwork with 3 actually pretty compelling and memorable stories. Really set the tone. And you did another thing that folks in the room all picked up on, and you got a question at the end: why no slides?
Yes, that was fascinating to me. I would have thought by then it would have been abundantly obvious why I didn't have any slides, because I am a confirmed storyteller. And I don't think, it's rare anyway, that if you're telling a good story that we feel the need for slides. I think there are 2 justifications for slides, and there's one very strong argument against it. The very strong argument against it I'll take first, which is that we don't multitask very well. In fact, most of the research seems to show that we can't multitask at all. We actually do one thing and then another, and switching between one and another thing costs us something, right? There's an information loss or energy loss or something when you switch from one thing to another. So as a speaker, you're asking that audience to pay attention to you, and then pay attention to the slides, and then back to you, and then back to the slides. There's a cost each time you do that, right? So that's the argument against it, is multitasking is not a good idea. The argument for it is, as I say, I think there are a couple. One is you have data that can only be really made comprehensible in a way that, say, a graph or a chart or a bar or a line or something that makes it much clearer, pictures that make things more compelling. And then the other is, I've seen people who do a talk, say a 40-minute talk, and they'll have 200 slides. And the slides will really be a commentary on the talk, and they'll just be clicking right through them very, very fast, right? And it'll often be a humorous commentary, a joke in reference to something the speaker has said. And I've seen people make that work. And so if you think of it really as kind of as humorous wallpaper, then people do make that work. But that's a huge
Okay, great advice. Some good thoughts on that. I thought that question was very interesting. Maybe not because it was so obvious to you as a confirmed storyteller, but also because we're so conditioned that that's what we expect is a slideshow. And a lot of them are bad, and we're all very familiar with that, but we're struggling with how to get out of that mix. So let's take it for a minute into, because you went over some other great topics in that session. Let's take it into a conference room or into a face-to-face meeting. So out of presentation mode, you had a lot of great tips about how one might carry themselves, establish a connection, and really, with body language and other techniques, frame a conversation in a way that was very productive. I'm wondering if you can give us the top 2 or 3 tips in that area.
Sure. The big insight is really that we evolved as a species to communicate mostly unconsciously. And so we are very good at picking up intent from other people, but we do it unconsciously. Our unconscious minds read friend or foe when somebody comes into a room. We do that very efficiently, we do that fast, we do that unconsciously. And so you can leave your communications to chance, and they'll largely go along at that kind of level, or you can decide to control those communications and therefore take control, let's say, of the conversation or the meeting in a way that's much more powerful than if you just leave it to chance. So that's really the first insight, is if you can focus your unconscious communications, and we can talk about how you do that, but if you can focus those unconscious communications, then you can begin to lead others in a more powerful way. And the basic reason is, very quickly, that most of us go through the day with lots on our mind. We have a long to-do list, right? We're going from one meeting, we're going to another, we're thinking about lunch, we're thinking about remembering to pick up eggs on the way home. We've got all this going around in our heads. And we embody that attitude toward life most of the time. So we're distracted. When somebody comes along who's focused, and who is focused powerfully on a single emotion and a single task, that is very powerful force. It affects us strongly. That emotion infects us and overcomes it, sweeps us along. So if you can focus your emotions and you can focus your mental activity before going into a meeting or before going into a one-to-one conversation, you'll come across as a much more powerful, natural leader than somebody who typically, as most of us do, just goes around with lots on their minds.
Okay, so let me ask you a question here and see if you have a different answer for these 2 scenarios, because one thing for CIOs and IT leaders is to lead in a couple of different ways, in a couple of different directions. So one might be, I'm about to walk into a meeting to lead my team, or even a cross-functional team as the sort of head person in the room, and I want to sort of have a commanding presence as you've described. The other scenario might be, I'm going to go into a room of executives that are peers or maybe superior to me, senior executives, board members, something of that ilk, but be seen as a leader, certainly of my domain and hopefully beyond that space. Would you do anything, first of all, if you have any specific tips, that would be great, something concrete, and I'm interested if you would do something different in each of those scenarios, or maybe it's the same thing.
Of course, the answer as a consultant's answer is it depends. But the deeper answer is, so you're going into a meeting where it's your team. They know you well. The issue there is really about focus and catching their attention, because in any kind of ongoing relationship like that, where these people are very used to you, and they know what your pet peeves are, and they know what's always on your mind, right? It's hard to cut through that kind of mental clutter and get people's attention. One of the things we don't do very well in this loaded era is pay close attention to each other. So, so to catch that attention, you really have to focus in a way that will command people's attention powerfully. When, on the other hand, when you're going into a meeting of, say, the board or your peers or people who are higher or above you in the hierarchy, then what you want to do is show up in a way that's open and confident. So you want to hold on to that expertise. And what I've seen over the years, I've worked with a number of IT leaders, and not to put too fine a point on it, that because they're not necessarily very comfortable communicators, they often show up just a little bit defensive. And it's not really because they're not confident in their expertise, they are. But what they're not confident about is holding their own in a room full of people who are perhaps more naturally communications comfortable, skilled than they are, right? So and so they show up a little defensive, and they have certain body language tells, if you will, that say, I'm just a little uncomfortable here. I'm not strong. I'm not open. I'm not in charge of my own area or my expertise. And so that's really the trick there, is to stay open and to stay confident in a room full of people who are either your peers or above you in the hierarchy.
And then I've heard some specific tips in the past about maybe priming for that experience. So I may go into a private space and hold a power pose for a few minutes. I may work on some breathing. I may use a technique to sort of clear my mind or prepare myself in a certain way. Any specific tips like that you have for us?
Well, breathing's always good. I'm a big fan of breathing. One of the issues that people may not think about is that because we spend a lot of time sitting down as we are now, we spend a lot of time on airplanes, we spend a lot of time in front of computers. One of the things that does is it tends to drive the voice up into your head and makes it more nasal. So your voice ends up sounding like this, right? And that's kind of a nasty noise. But what's more than that, what the research shows is that that sound has an odd effect on other people. It doesn't instill confidence. It makes them irritated on the one hand, but it also makes them think less of you. And so one of the things you need to do is to breathe properly, but not just to calm yourself down, but also to keep your voice nice and strong and resonant, because the voice is a huge part of the way in which we interact with other people. And if my voice is up here and I sound like this, you're going to write me off as some sort of lunatic, or like I don't know what I'm talking about, or maybe I'm just annoying, right? But if instead I take a deep breath and I bring my voice down here into a more resonant area, then you're going to be more likely to listen to me and accept me as a leader. So that's one of the hazards of modern life, is we spend a lot of time sitting, and it's hard to breathe.
So are you a fan of the power pose technique?
I am, in a sense. The only problem with that is there's nothing wrong with adopting a power pose. I mean, it will have the effect, the research shows, it will calm down the stress hormones a little bit and increase the endorphins and the positive chemicals in the brain. So that's a good thing. But the problem is it doesn't affect mental processes as much as you might like. So if you're nervous going into a meeting, the reason you're nervous is partly because of those physical symptoms, but partly also because your brain is having a dialogue with your body. And what your brain is saying is, oh no, so-and-so is going to screw me again in the meeting like he always has, or gee, I don't have a command of those numbers that I ought to have, or I think the boss is mad at me, or whatever the issue is that's got you nervous to begin with, right? You're playing that in your head. That gives you the physical symptoms of nervousness, and then what happens is your brain interprets the physical symptoms as further evidence that you're about to screw up or that there's something that's going to happen wrong. And the power pose doesn't really change that dialogue. So in addition to working on any body language things that you can, you also need to work on the internal dialogue. You need to prepare for the meeting, and you need to talk to that voice, the one that undercuts you, because that voice is tied to your unconscious mind. And what will happen is it will betray you if you don't work with it. So if you've got a little voice in your head saying, "You're not ready, Nick, this isn't going to go well, you're going to screw up," then what happens is my unconscious mind is going to start playing tricks on me. It's going to make me forgetful. It's going to make me more stressful. My brain's going to work more slowly than it otherwise would. And so in a lot of ways, I'm going to underperform what I naturally would if I were confident. So it's not enough just to do this Superwoman, Superman power pose. You also have to work on the mental dialogue.
So how do we talk to it, and what do we say?
Well, the quick answer is every time the voice shows up and starts to cut you down, and you know what that is. We all, as grown-ups, we might not like to talk about it, but we all know that voice that says, this isn't going to work, or oh, you're in trouble, or this is not going well. That little voice, right? Every time that voice shows up, you have to encounter it. You have to answer it in your head. You just have to talk back to it. And that sounds kind of tedious in a way, and it is. It's an ongoing argument. But the reason that voice keeps coming back is because it's tied to some powerful emotion in your unconscious mind. That's the sign, in fact, that there is something in your unconscious mind. And that is tied to some memory, some time when things didn't go well. It's tied to some incident that happened in the past when you screwed up and you were deeply embarrassed by that, right? And what happens is the brain is very good at focusing memory and emotion, tying those two things together, and it will push it down into your unconscious, and it will keep coming back to betray you unless you work with it, unless you fight it. So the longer answer is you've got to figure out what those issues are that are slowing you down. I talk about this in the book, and figure out a positive mantras to fight back, and gradually retrain your unconscious mind so that it can work with you in a positive way instead of undercutting you. And the way you know, the proof of the pudding is if you still got that little voice in your head, then it's tied to some unconscious memory or trauma or issue that you haven't dealt with yet.
Great. So that sounds like a whole other session, maybe, to get involved with how do we uncover and discover that? Because I've read and heard different things. You know, whether you ignore that voice, whether you take it on and debate it directly, whether you try and embrace it in some way. So there's a lot in that realm. But I think everybody knows what you're talking about in that space as well. As we get ready to wrap up here, I'm just curious. Just thinking generally about IT folks you've had experience with, folks in an IT leadership position, any last bit of advice or specific ideas that come to mind for folks that are in this engineering or IT leadership realm?
Yeah, sure. Your job basically is to translate between two worlds. The higher up you get in the organization, the more crucial this becomes. You've got to translate between the IT world, which basically most of your business colleagues is never going to understand, and their world, their business world. So they care about profit and loss and all the things that business people care about. And you understand the IT stuff that underlies that now and makes it possible. Your job is to translate between those two things, bring those two together. So you've got to learn the metaphors and the stories that bring to life why the things that you care about down there in the IT world will affect and matter to the business world. That's really the job. It's a translation job. If you get that right, then there's no stopping you. You can persuade that business world of the importance of IT. We can't operate with IT these days. No business works without it. It's a reality, and yet it's astonishing to me how little business people really understand what's going on in IT and how much their future depends on it. And so that's a translation process that still needs to be done. That was the case 10 years ago when I was working with some IT people in a very extended and deep way. It was a great experience. I had a couple of years working with these IT folks, these researchers, and that was the issue then, and it's still the issue now. And in fact, maybe even more so because it's gotten harder. IT hasn't gotten easier to understand. Just try explaining the cloud to somebody who doesn't understand it. Right? So I think that's really the issue.
Yeah, and I think that's great advice because folks don't understand it well, but they also, I think us as IT leaders need to understand that people don't want to understand it well. So I think the idea of the metaphors and the stories to get at the essence of the message is great advice, and that's kind of right where we started and right where we'll end. And I just want to thank you so much for your time and expertise, and just encourage everybody who's watching or listening to this to to go to publicwords.com and check out Nick Morgan's work. It's really great stuff. Thanks very much.
Tom, thanks so much. Great chatting with you.